From a 184-pound metal ball that terrified a superpower, to a horrific launchpad fire that nearly ended the dream, to the most expensive footprints ever left in the dust. This is the true story of the space race. And it wasn't just a peaceful quest for science and exploration. It was a desperate, deadly political war fueled by pure paranoia. By the end of this, you'll know exactly how the Cold War left Earth, and you will never look at the moon the same way again. But this story begins where American confidence died. The year is 1957. The Cold War is simmering. The United States firmly believes it is the undisputed king of global technology. Until October 4th, when the Soviet Union casually launches Sputnik 1 into orbit. It's just a shiny sphere with 4 antennas, about the size of a beach ball. It doesn't drop bombs. It doesn't spy. All it does is emit a simple, continuous radio beep as it circles the globe. Sir, that beach ball is beeping at us in Russian, but that beep sent shockwaves of sheer terror across America. If the Soviets could strap a metal ball to an intercontinental ballistic missile and shoot it into space, what was stopping them from strapping a nuclear warhead to it and dropping it on New York? President Dwight D. Eisenhower tried to play it cool. He called Sputnik one small ball in the air. But behind closed doors, the pressure was immense. To catch up, Eisenhower signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act in 1958. NASA was born. The race was officially on. But if America thought they could quickly overtake the Soviets, they were dead wrong. Fast forward to April 12, 1961. The Soviet Union delivers a devastating second punch. Cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin becomes the first human being to journey into outer space. Down in Washington, a new president was watching, John F. Kennedy had campaigned on the promise of closing the missile gap with the Soviets. Instead, he was watching them literally fly circles around the globe. And the timing. It couldn't have been worse. Gagarin's flight happened just days before the infamous Bay of Pigs invasion, a disastrous CIA-backed attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro in Cuba that embarrassed Kennedy on the world stage. Kennedy was bleeding political capital. He needed a win. A big, impossible win that the Soviets couldn't easily match. Sir, might I suggest a trip to the moon? He asked his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, to find a space program that promised dramatic results in which the U.S. could win. The answer was lunar exploration. But there was a massive catch. At that point, the United States had only managed to put astronaut Alan Shepard in space for a grand total of 15 minutes. He didn't even orbit the Earth. Kennedy was basically betting the entire nation's pride on a game he didn't even know how to play yet. So how do you win a race when you are miles behind the starting line? You move the finish line. On September 12, 1962, at Rice University in Texas, Kennedy delivered a speech that would define an entire generation. He looked out at the massive crowd and declared that America would put a man on the moon before the decade was out. Not because it was easy, but because it was hard. It sounded incredibly inspiring on television. But behind the scenes, NASA engineers were practically having panic attacks. To fulfill Kennedy's promise, they had to invent technologies that didn't even exist yet. They needed rockets 100 times more powerful, completely new computers, and orbital rendezvous techniques that were purely theoretical. Sir, we haven't even figured out how to use the bathroom in zero gravity yet. But Kennedy opened the federal checkbook. NASA's budget exploded, eventually eating up nearly 5.5% of the entire federal budget. Over 400,000 Americans were put to work on the Apollo program. It was the largest peacetime mobilization in human history. And the Soviets? They didn't just sit back and watch. They launched the first woman into space, Valentina Tereshkova, and performed the first ever spacewalk. Every time America took a step, Moscow took two. But then, the unthinkable happened. In November 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. The nation was shattered. The new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, was now carrying the weight of a traumatized country. He immediately realized that the moon landing was no longer just a political goal. It had become a martyr's sacred final wish. To back down now would be an insult to Kennedy's legacy. Failure was officially off the table, so NASA pushed harder, faster, more recklessly. And when you push the boundaries of physics on a strict political deadline, physics usually pushes back. It is January 27, 1967. The Apollo 1 crew, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, are strapped into their command module for a routine pre-flight test on the launch pad at Cape Kennedy. The capsule is sealed shut. To simulate the environment of space, the cabin is pressurized with 100% pure oxygen. It was supposed to be a standard, boring rehearsal. They weren't even fueled with rocket propellant, but deep inside the miles of wiring beneath the astronauts' seats, a single frayed wire sparked. And in a pure oxygen environment, a spark doesn't just start a fire. It creates an explosive inferno. Within seconds, the temperature inside the capsule soared to over 2,000 degrees. The astronauts tried to escape, but the heavy hatch was designed to open inward. The intense internal pressure essentially welded it shut. It was over in less than a minute. All three men perished. The nation watched in horror. The space race ground to a devastating, screeching halt. Investigations revealed horrific flaws in the capsule's design, exposed wiring, and highly flammable materials everywhere. President Johnson and NASA faced brutal congressional hearings. People started asking the hard questions. Was beating the Soviets really worth burning American heroes alive in a metal tin? The moon suddenly seemed very far away, and very, very expensive. Sir, the cost of this race is no longer just money. NASA had a choice. Cancel the program and admit defeat to the Soviet Union, or tear the Apollo spacecraft apart and rebuild it from scratch. They had less than 3 years to fulfill Kennedy's promise. And the clock was ticking louder than ever. So, NASA engineers went back to the drawing board. They completely ripped out the highly flammable materials, redesigned the spacecraft hatch to open outward in just 3 seconds, and changed the cabin atmosphere mix. They also perfected the most powerful machine ever built by human hands, the Saturn V rocket. Standing 363 feet tall and packing 7.5 million pounds of thrust. It wasn't just a rocket. It was essentially a controlled skyscraper explosion. It had to be. They were going to the moon. By the time 1969 rolled around, the political landscape had shifted. Lyndon Johnson was out. Richard Nixon was now sitting in the Oval Office, ready to inherit the finish line of the greatest race in human history. Nixon fully understood the stakes. This wasn't just an American scientific triumph. It was the ultimate global flex. He even had a speechwriter draft a secret contingency plan. It was grimly titled In Event of Moon Disaster. If the astronauts were stranded on the lunar surface with no way to blast off, Nixon would go on live television to tell the world they were being left there to die, and the radio feeds would be cut. Sir, that is a terribly morbid backup plan, but failure wasn't an option. On July 16, 1969, Apollo 11 launched from Cape Kennedy. Inside the command module were Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. 4 days later, Armstrong and Aldrin climbed into the lunar module, named Eagle, and began their descent to the surface. Colin stayed behind in orbit, becoming the absolute most isolated man in the universe. But the descent was anything but smooth, just thousands of feet above the rocky surface. The lunar module's primitive computer became overloaded. The master alarm blared. It was the dreaded 1202 program alarm. The guidance system was struggling to keep up. Down in mission control, engineers had mere seconds to decide whether to abort the mission, sending the astronauts hurling back into orbit, or trust the glitchy hardware. They chose to trust it. They told them to go, but the computer was aiming them right toward a massive crater filled with boulders the size of cars. Armstrong had to take manual control, flying the Eagle almost like a helicopter over the deadly rocks, desperately searching for a flat spot in the gray dust. And as he flew, Mission Control called out the fuel remaining. 60 seconds. 30 seconds. 15 seconds of fuel left before a crash. Hold your breath, folks. And then, contact. Armstrong's voice crackled over the radio. Houston. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. On July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped off the ladder and delivered the words that are now etched into human history. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. For a few hours, two human beings walked around in the alien dirt, planted an American flag, collected some rocks, and looked back at a tiny, blue Earth. To get there, the United States spent approximately $25 billion, which equates to well over $250 billion today. They sacrificed 3 astronauts' lives and employed hundreds of thousands of people. The Soviet Union eventually scrapped their manned lunar program entirely. The United States had done the impossible. They had won the space race, ending the ultimate Cold War measuring contest. So, the next time you look up at the moon, remember that it wasn't just a peaceful quest for science. From a beeping metal ball that sparked absolute terror, to a devastating fire, to the most expensive footprints in history. We didn't go to the moon just to explore it. We went to the moon to make sure the Soviets didn't get there first. But if you think that was an intense political gamble, wait until you hear about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Click right here to keep watching. And make sure to subscribe.